Friends, this evening I'm going to discuss a book that was published in 1975. And I first became acquainted with this work around 1990 when I was writing my doctoral dissertation. And I've had occasion to return to this book very recently, in the last 10 days, because its author passed on the 24th of May. I'm speaking about this book here, a book by Susan Brownmiller called Against Our Will: Men, Women, and Rape. And I have to say that the book, on a rereading of it, I never did finish the entire book on my first reading some 35 years ago. And I'm not going to pretend that I finished it now. I have read well over half of it. The book is 540 pages in length. And it's not really necessary to read all of it because once one has read a number of chapters and has seen the manner in which she treats her material, the author treats her material, one can reasonably surmise at what she's going to say in the other portions of the book. Now, I want to say a few things about Susan Brownmiller before I move on to the book. I have to say the book has left a deep impression on me this time. As I said, I was aware of it before and have referred to it every now and then, but I didn't realize just how powerful a work it is until I reread it in the last few days. So Susan Brownmiller was 90 years old when she died on May 24th in a hospital in the Bronx. And she has been an iconic figure. She's been a New Yorker really her whole life. She was born in Brooklyn in 1935 to lower middle class Jewish parents. Her mother was a secretary. Her father was a sales clerk at Macy's. Their obituaries of Susan Brownmiller published both in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I encourage readers to go to those obituaries for some information. But the little that I want to say here before I venture into the book is, I think, quite important because she was really quite a personality as well. So Susan Brownmiller grew up, as I said, in a Jewish family, which went to Hebrew school. Um, but I don't think she ever really thought of herself as really Jewish. That is to say that she didn't really emphasize, and I think her parents didn't emphasize her Jewish heritage. And I think that the fate of Jewish women and the Holocaust was obviously something that becomes part of her study on rape. But I think it would be difficult to think of her as a woman who was working really in the tradition, let's say, of Jewish philosophy, right? Nevertheless, it's important to underscore the fact that Susan Brownmiller, as I think this book alone shows, along with some of her later work, including a book called Femininity, which, again, I've had some familiarity with, that Susan Brownmiller was an extremely erudite and learned woman as well. So she did go to Cornell University, spent a couple of years there, apparently did not graduate from Cornell. And then in the early 1970s, she began to work um, partly as a researcher and as a journalist. She was a staff writer for the Village Voice, quite a legendary, of course, publication. And she worked as a news writer for ABC TV. The early 1970s, she starts to become active in the feminist movement, according to the obituary that was published in the New York Times. And I quote, she spearheaded feminist gatherings and helped coordinate a 1970s sit-in at Ladies' Home Journal to protest the magazine's focus on beauty and housework and the dearth of women on its editorial staff. And Susan Brownmiller said at a much later date that she always thought of herself as a very strong woman, someone who was combative, right? Verbally aggressive. And I think that that comes through in this particular book. In 1970, that same year, she appeared on the Dick Cavett show, where, along with Hugh Hefner, the publisher of Playboy, and from all accounts, she made mincemeat of Hugh Hefner, criticized him obviously for building an empire based on the oppression of women, denying them their humanity, degrading them, and apparently, according to both the obituaries, in one of her final, shots at Hefner on this show, she said that she was waiting for the day, quote, that you are willing to come out here with a cottontail attached to your rear end, referring, of course, to the cocktail waitresses, otherwise known as bunnies, at his Playboy clubs. According to the obituary, quote, Mr. Hefner was speechless. He said later that he didn't have the language to respond to that kind of thing. And later in life as well, in fact, throughout her life, adult life, Susan Brownmiller, remained a resolute opponent of the pornography industry. There is, of course, a whole politics, an intense feminist politics around the question of the pornography industry, with I would say the vast majority of feminists weighing in against it. But we do know that there are feminist scholars who have in fact argued that we need to look at sex work in a very different way. This is not the time and place to get into that, because what I really want to do is I do want to get into this book, uh, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. Now, I think the first thing that needs to be said about this book is that it is thoroughly researched. All right. So I mentioned its length. She really looks at uh, the institution of rape, the practice of rape across a spectrum of cultures and societies. She looks at rape in relationship to racism. She looks at rape in wartime. And when she's looking at rape in wartime, she's looking at rape in World War I, World War II. She looks at the Nuremberg war crime trials and the Tokyo war crime trials proceedings, because in both of these cases, there was certainly a lot of material on rape and the sexual violation of women. And of course, as she points out, that one of the things that was discussed in the Tokyo war crime trials, or the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the formal name by which it was known, was what was called the rape of Nanking. And the invasion of Nanking, as she points out, and brutalization of the city, that whole episode is simply known through the metaphor of rape. People just routinely speak of the rape of Nanking. Some people may be familiar with a book by that name, by Iris Chang, which brought the story of Nanking back into the consciousness of the West, three some odd decades ago. But as Susan Brownmiller points out, the tribunal had addressed this question, and she speaks about it at some length, a few pages as well. So she discusses rape in Vietnam, World War I, World War II. And more generally, she looks at the question of rape in wartime and what is the significance of rape in wartime. All right. And I'm going to turn to, in fact, uh, one instance of our discussion shortly, which is very surprising, and would certainly make Susan Brownmiller one of the first persons to have in the West to have really discussed it, and certainly one of the first feminists to have brought this particular example that she talks about to the attention of the West. But before we do that, let me turn to the second. And now this is a far more substantive point. This is not simply a point about how thoroughly the book is researched and the wide scope of this work, trying to understand, you know, the perspective of women and looking even at, for example, literature, looking at a large capacious literature from psychology, from psychoanalysis, and all of that. The point I want to turn to, the second principal point, a substantive one, is this: that most people assume that the story of rape is a story of lust. Okay? That is to say, yes, there's an awareness of the fact that it's an exercise by a man of his power over a woman, but it's generally assumed to be the case that when uh, men rape women, they are fulfilling a sexual desire. They're fulfilling their sexual lust. Susan Brownmiller obviously is not going to discount that argument, but that is not the principal argument of this book. Okay? This book is a work, and in that respect, it makes it really quite unique. The book is viewed as being unique because it was the first book where a feminist in particular, you know, uh, had the daring, the courage to address a subject about which many people are queasy. Rape is not the kind of word that you utter in polite society, so to speak. Okay, um, and she takes it head on and takes it on with a courage that is really quite extraordinary, I think, in particularly in view of the kind of interpretations that she's going to put forward. Um, so part of that courage resides in suggesting that, look, it is not simply a crime of lust that we're speaking about here. All right. Uh, what we have to understand principally is the way in which the story of rape is a story of crushing, coercive power exercised by men over women, right? And I should turn straight away to perhaps what is the most controversial passage in this book, which appears on page 281 over here. 281 over here, okay, of this Bantam paperback. And when I quote this passage, I will also discuss the very sleight of hand that both the obituaries exercise, right? So, what she says on page 281, this is in the context of race that she makes this particular uh, assertion. All right. And that assertion is um, the excuse me, the following. I'm just looking at the beginning of this. So here, this is what she says. Um, by pitting white women against black men and their effort to alert the nation to the extra punishment wreaked on blacks for a case of interracial rape, leftists and liberals with a defense lawyer mentality drove a wedge between two movements for human rights. And today we are still struggling to overcome this historic legacy. I will return to this later on. Yet the similarities between the types of oppression suffered by blacks and women and heaped upon black women are more impressive than the antagonisms between us. As I have stated elsewhere, the rapist performs a myrmidon function for all men by keeping all women in a thrall of anxiety and fear. And here is the crucial line, the most crucial line. Rape is to women as lynching was to blacks, the ultimate physical threat by which all men keep all women in a state of psychological intimidation. Let me repeat myself. Rape is to women as lynching was to blacks. Right? So every black had this fear in the United States from, say, around 1890s through to the 1930s, 1940s. Right? Every black person had this fear, particularly a black man, that you could be lynched. So rape is to women as lynching was to blacks, the ultimate physical threat by which all men keep all women in a state of psychological intimidation. Now, what is quite interesting here is that if you look at both the Washington Post obituary and the New York Times obituary, both of them, of course, that can be accessed on the internet, both of them say that all men keep all women, that the word all, both times, in the original is in italics. And I can assure you it is not. Okay? This is what we're speaking about, the lines over here. Right? It is not in italics. Now, where is the sleight of hand here? The sleight of hand here is that both the obituaries are suggesting that this is where there was an extraordinary kind of exaggeration, that now there is a kind of a victimization of men that Susan Brownmiller was really engaging in. Because really, can anyone believe that all men, you know, are rapists? And indeed, all men are not rapists. And Susan Brownmiller is not saying that all men are rapists. What she's simply saying is that all women, in the first instance, live with the fear, to whatever degree, the fear of being raped. And that potentially, so to speak, every man may well be or can be a rapist, much in the way in which every man in Nazi Germany could well become a killer, we might say, right? That is to say that she's not suggesting, okay, that men or the vast majority of men or even the majority of men are rapists. But what she is really saying, and I think that that is a crucial difference, is what I have mentioned before, and something that she was going to reiterate, okay, uh, towards the end of her life. But she's saying that all women know that this is something that can happen to them. And in principle, it's possible to think that men who might otherwise be very good fathers and very good husbands and very good brothers could well be rapists too. Right? Now, it is, however, passages like this which made her very controversial. And when the book came out in 1975, it was subjected to a certain degree of ridicule, particularly in some very conservative publications. Um, the I think it's the obituary that appears in, I believe, the Washington Post, which I think has a quotation from the National Review, the review that appeared in the National Review, a very conservative magazine, where a journalist by the name of Joseph Sobran said that Ms. Brownmiller was engaged, quote, in not scholarship but henpecking, that conscious process of intimidation by which all women keep all men in terror, end quote. Now you can see, of course, that that's already trivializing what Brownmiller is saying. And in fact, what Sobran didn't quite realize, he thought he might have been just very clever and very funny, is that there is another problem, and that is the manner in which rape is often trivialized and had historically certainly been trivialized. And there were many reasons why it was trivialized. One of those reasons, of course, was this persistent view that a woman really can't be raped. That is to say that, that she can't be raped unless she wants to be raped, that there is a subconscious desire within her to be raped, and only in that sense can one really speak of a woman being raped, that the woman always has a capacity to resist the oppressor. And this is, of course, the casual version of this is that, well, the woman who's been raped asked for it in some way or the other, right? So that those are all forms of trivialization. They're much worse than that, but they're all forms of trivialization. And effectively, the trivialization of Brownmiller in this review was very much in keeping with that kind of thinking. All right. But let us now turn to some substantive aspects. So, why this book is very powerful. So, this book really was crucially important in bringing a dialogue of rape into the public sphere in the United States and in many other countries. It was some of the arguments that she advances get taken up seriously in international forums. I think we have to give her credit for that. Centers that were set up in the United States for the relief of women who had been raped, rape relief crisis centers, for example, many of these came in the wake of this book against our will. All right. So we can speak of its importance in that sense. We can speak of the importance of this book as having introduced the subject to the public sphere and making it impossible to henceforth uh, really avoid the subject and constantly trivialize it, and to focus the attention now. This book helps to focus the attention on women as victims of rape. All right. So those are some of the more, if I may put it this way, elementary ways in which this book is important. Some of the material and public ways in which this book is important, as I said, both in the U.S. and a number of other societies. But I think there's a much more intellectual way in which this book becomes very important. And I will give it in a formula here and then spend the rest of the time looking at several illustrations of the ways in which she argues and illustrations also of her courage. That argument is essentially the following, that when, and we could refine this by saying that this is that the proposition I'm going to put forward is all the more true, for example, in a situation of war, okay, or in a situation where there is clearly competition, let's say between two communities, two nations, two groups of men, and so on. When a man rapes a woman, he's not only, okay, he's not only exercising his power over her, filling her with terror, conveying the fact of his superiority over her. That is unquestionably the case. But there's another level to it. That when a man is raping a woman, he is conveying a message. For example, to her family, to her husband, to her male siblings, to her sons. He is conveying a message to the men of the community to which she belongs that you do not have the power to protect your women. The woman, in that sense, therefore, is incidental. That is to say that the sexual, the brutal physical sexual violation of a woman, we can see this more transparently in war, because wartime rape is very common across nearly every major war that one can think of. Okay? That the men are conveying a message to the men of the opposing side that you folks are just effeminate. You're emasculated men. You're not really men because you don't really have the power over your women. And by sexually violating your women, we are giving you a demonstrable evidence of that. This is, in other words, there is the woman is the communicative medium through which men are negotiating power for their community against the power of another community. Right? This is central to her explication of rape in many instances. Now, let's take a couple of illustrations. So, for example, and I had mentioned 5-10 minutes ago that I'm going to give an illustration of one context of war in which she speaks of rape, which really struck me this time around, right? And that is that she has a lengthy discussion, fairly lengthy discussion, it's almost 10 pages long, of rape in the war that was fought in 1971, which led to the liberation of East Pakistan, which then became the state of Bangladesh. Now, this is really surprising. So this discussion takes place between pages 78 and 87 of this edition of the book, Bangladesh. The rape of Bangladesh, she uses that phrase, analogous to the rape of Nanking, suggesting that rape was a crucial element in this story. I dare say that most historians haven't really given the subject of rape as much attention as they should have. And once again, in the Bangladesh war, and Pakistan, of course, there's almost no discussion of it whatsoever, as there's very little discussion of the war to begin with, because it led, of course, to the vivisection of Pakistan, that Pakistan lost its eastern half, which became a separate country. But even in Bangladesh, part of the problem had to do with the cultural ethos of that time, of that area, of that area and that era, which makes it a matter of shame to speak about rape of a woman. And here we're speaking about the rape of possibly 200,000 women. That's what, and she's very open and candid about that. And she points, however, to the fact that initially, at least, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, recognizing the particular kind of suffering that had been inflicted upon Bengali women, had proclaimed all raped women heroines of the war for independence, which was a bit unusual. Of course, it was quite daring, because this is something that you keep silent about, right? And here there is a very interesting question that I won't get into, which of course she talks about as well, which is the silence that has often been pervasive about the question of rape. And this book, of course, was critically important in breaking that silence in many respects. But let's just go back to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, because the supposition is that in that society where women were relatively cloistered, to speak about the mass rape of women and to say that the our women who were raped are like heroines. Okay, we can do a lot more interpretive work there too, but it's sufficient to simply mention here what Mujibur Rahman had invoked. This, as I said, required a certain kind of daring at that time. Now, um, uh, and that section that she has on the rape of women in Bangladesh, in what was then East Pakistan and then became Bangladesh, she discusses how this issue actually becomes international. She says that the rape of women here in East Pakistan and Bangladesh is unique in one respect. Page 87, for the first time in history, the rape of women in war and the complex aftermath of mass assault received serious international attention. And that, in fact, the Bangladesh war becomes crucially important for the story of rape because it is henceforth that people will begin to speak of rape as a unspeakable crime, right? I think this is very interesting because Susan Brownmiller is really the first to advance, I would say, this argument. There are now lots of very interesting things which suggest that she's aware of some of the complexity of that area because she points out that even though West Pakistanis and East Pakistanis were Muslim, the similarities stopped there. They had a shared religious heritage, but the Punjabis, Pakistanis, West Pakistanis are lighter skinned. They're taller, raw boned. That the Bengalis were tended to be darker and, uh, and shorter in stature. And she says, quote, this racial difference would provide added anguish to those Bengali women who found themselves pregnant after their physical ordeal. And of course, it became a source of greater anguish because the children who were born, it would become difficult to disguise where these children had come from, right? But perhaps, I mean, you know, uh, the the argument could have been even yet more complex if she had been aware, as perhaps she was not, of the long history of the representation of Bengalis, all Bengalis, as effeminate. That is, the men being effeminate, because you can't use the word effeminate to describe women. Effeminate is describes a situation where a man is displaying characteristically feminine attributes and features and characteristics, right? Um, and so the politics of masculinity and femininity uh, there was quite complex, and she doesn't really get into all of that. She may not be well aware of it, but nevertheless, as I'm saying, she is aware of quite a few things when she's speaking about what happened over there. And there are times when I'm a bit uncertain about what her sources are because she doesn't give them. Uh, but here, let's take a passage on page 83. Pakistani soldiers had not only violated Bengali women on the spot, they abducted tens of hundreds and held them by force in their military barracks for nightly use. All right, so that doesn't surprise me at all. The women were kept naked to prevent their escape. Uh, I think we would need to know a bit more about that. It's really quite dramatic when she puts it that way. In some of the camps, pornographic movies were shown to the soldiers uh, in an obvious attempt to work the men up, one Indian writer reported. I don't know who this Indian writer is. Um, where were these pornographic movies drawn from that were shown in these camps in 1971, right? There were no DVDs then. So were these actual reels that were shown, 16 millimeter pornographic films, 35 mm? The video cassette recorder hadn't been invented at that time. So these would have had to be movie reels. So I'm not quite certain because she says pornographic movies. She's apparently quoting an Indian source, but as I said, we don't know the nature of that source. But what's again interesting is the detail with which she gets into this particular question. And she says that look, I mean, there's some conceit on the Indian side. So she has this extraordinary quotation from the celebrated writer Mulkraj Anand, who and I've never encountered this passage before. Um, so she says, quoting Mulkraj Anand now, right? Remember, some of our Bengali women are very beautiful, right? And so what he's suggesting, as she says, Mulkraj Anand is saying, there was a conspiracy. Because our women were so beautiful, there was all the more reason that the Pakistani soldiers, the Punjabi West Pakistani soldiers, wanted to violate our women. The more beautiful the woman, the greater the imperative to sexually violate her, right? The rapes were so systematic and pervasive that they had to be conscious army policy planned by the West Pakistanis in a deliberate effort to create a new race or to dilute Bengali nationalism, Anand passionately told reporters, page 86 of this book, right? Um, Now, there is certainly no question and that rape is used in wartime by men to, as I said, to not simply inflict pain upon a woman and to produce their own pleasure, but this rape is conveying a message, as I said, to the other side. What's also happening, of course, is that the man is planting his seed in that woman by raping her, right? And so, therefore, when and Anand is saying that was an attempt to create a kind of a new race, this is in that vein, right? That what rape is also doing is, particularly if it's viewed cumulatively and collectively, okay, in the course of a war, it is an attempt to alter the demographic realities, right? That's what he's really saying. But what is interesting again is the astuteness with which Susan Brownmiller is picking up on all of this, okay, in 1975, right? Now, let me just turn to another context for 5, 10 minutes, and I'll wrap up my uh, discussion of this book. And so, pages, let's go to the early pages, and then I want to look at her treatment of the question of rape uh, in relationship to race, on which there is, of course, a literature that is sometimes controversial and always difficult to read. That is difficult to read, for moral reasons. Difficult because it brings to the fore um, the complicated ways in which people who may be of progressive views nonetheless may instrumentalize rape for certain kinds of ends, right? Um, we'll get to that. But page 43, where she begins her discussion of uh, rape and its history in World War II. And this is what she says: as interpreted by the loyal philosopher servants of the Third Reich, fascism's very nature was an exaggeration of the values that normal society held to be masculine. Right? So there she's immediately now moving into the domain of rape as an exercise of a certain kind of virile masculinity, right? Goebbels himself had said as much, and before him Nietzsche, that fount of inspiration. She's quite she can write with irony and in a tone that is not necessarily mocking, but is clearly ironical, right? Goebbels himself had said as much, and before him Nietzsche, that fount of inspiration had instructed, quote, man should be trained for war and woman for the recreation of the warrior, right? Um, here is a little illustration of a number of things: her use of various kinds of sources, her erudition, the fact that she's able to hone in on this issue of virile masculinity and rape as a demonstration of that, uh, uh, by quoting people like Nietzsche and so on. But what this passage also alerts us to is the particular kind of and endorsement is not the right word. The salience with which one can speak of the place of rape, the way it has been almost naturalized in the culture of the West in this case, but as she's going to point out, in nearly every culture, partly because the contempt for women runs deep in almost every culture, right? So, and then she's uh, uh, you know in continuation of that passage, she's then has another passage which she's attributes to Albert Speer. Hitler always said that the masses are essentially feminine, right? And again, by the way, this is an argument that, of course, doesn't begin with Hitler. Gustave Le Bon, in his book on the crowd, said that the crowd is always feminine, right? It's a mass of people without a head. It just acts instinctively and doesn't have any faculty of reason whatsoever. Right? I'm summarizing his whole argument, the argument of the entire book in just two sentences. So, again, this has a long history. Hitler always said that the masses are essentially feminine, and his aggressiveness and charisma elicited an almost masochistic surrender and submission in his audience, a form of psychic rape. So Albert Speer is looking back later on and saying, well, that's what Hitler was. That, when you see these Nuremberg rallies and you see these countless number of soldiers in formation, you think of yourself as that this is an extraordinary demonstration of disciplined masculinity, but it's also a demonstration of psychic rape, you know? That's what Speer is saying. He didn't convince his audiences, he conquered them. This is Speer writing about Hitler, right? Now, there's so many interesting, passages here. The book really deserves a lot of attention. Um, but uh, and Brownmiller is quite candid in saying that, look, I mean, that there are other feminist scholars, Kate Millett, of course, Sexual Politics. This was an exceedingly important work. If one had to think, let's say, of uh, uh, you know uh, three or four books that were crucially important. This was one book. Then there was Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, and there was Shulamit Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, um, all coming out roughly within the space of 5-10 years. And here she is relying in part upon Kate Millett's book, which had come out a bit earlier, uh, saying that, look, Millett has reached the same argument, and what is the argument that she really wants to advance here? The point I want to make here, page 44, is that as rape is the quintessential act by which a male demonstrates to a female that she is conquered, vanished by his superior strength and power, right? It was perfectly logical within the framework of fascism that rape would be employed by the German soldier as he strove to prove himself a worthy Superman. Rape for the Germans, I'm skipping a couple of lines, and to a similar extent for the Japanese, played a serious and logical role in the achievement of what they saw as their ultimate objective: the total humiliation and destruction of inferior peoples and the establishment of their own master race. And this is a different way of stating what I had pointed out is the principal argument of the book. Because here, this is not a story just of lust, of men just wanting to have sexual fulfillment because, oh, they're in a war situation and, they're away from their homes and they can't make love to their wives, you know. And of course, that's why armies had brothels. There were institutionalized system of army brothels, as there were brothels at concentration camps, right? A whole story over there. What she's saying here is this, that rape is one of the ways in which one establishes a total humiliation and destruction of inferior peoples and the establishment of their own master race. And of course, every situation of rape is not a situation in war. She's well aware of that, of course, right? But she's suggesting that even when it's not a situation of war, one cannot really think only of the rape of a woman as merely a way in which a man is fulfilling his sexual desires. Now, that may well be the case, that that there's nothing else to it from the point of view of the rapist. But a rape doesn't take place in a vacuum. It takes place in a certain kind of social context. So and this is what allows me to move into the last set of remarks I want to offer. So if you're looking, for example, at the United States and you're looking at interracial rape, right? So here you think to yourself, okay, there's an instance of a black man who's raped a white woman, and he's doing, he's simply fulfilling his sexual lust, right? But is he only doing that? Because, of course, the question would be that the white female was that sexual object of desire that he could not even think about. That in Jim Crow South and in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, that if a black woman even looked at a white woman with as much as lust or made a slightest pass at her, he almost certainly had placed himself in the jaws of death. Right? Now, so fast forward 1980, 1990, if a black man rapes a white woman, what is a larger context within which we understand that, right? And that is the discussion she has in this long chapter called A Question of Race, which is a chapter that chapter 7 begins on page 230 of the edition of the Bantam edition, paperback edition over here, and extends to page 282, 50 to 53 pages, right? And what the first part of it that she talks about is she's really looking at a large sets of data from various places, from various institutions. And the gist of it is to point out that that when we're looking at interracial rape, what we're also looking at is the fact that white men who raped black women often paid no price. We're not speaking simply about the days of slavery, when obviously they didn't pay any price at all, because the supposition that a white slave owner was raping his own slave didn't exist. That is, that she was his property, and therefore it was for him to do what he wanted with her. And from the standpoint of society, none of that could be described as rape to begin with. Okay? Because to rape a woman is to appropriate the body of someone else, is to take possession of someone else, right? And to do so against their will. a slave woman has no will of her own on that reading, and therefore a slave woman couldn't be raped. But but in the interracial rape statistics that she's citing now, she's talking about long after the end of slavery, and she's talking about contemporary times and also 1940s, 50s, 60s, right? Where she's saying that the rate of conviction, she's looking at large number of databases, she's looking at different parts of the U.S. Uh, uh, rate of conviction of white men who raped black women was by far the lowest. All right, the rate of conviction for black men who rape white women was at least 10 times higher in almost every context that you can think of. All right. Um, Now, there's a lot of discussion of that. We won't go over that in the interest of time. What I'm most interested in is just a few pages with which I will end my discussion of this book. Um, she's really speaking here about and I should say, by the way, that arguments have been advanced by a number of scholars that her understanding, for example, of let's say the Emmett Till case. Um, the Emmett Till case, of course, is a legendary part of the whole history of the civil rights movement, and I have a number, at least I think one, if not two, blog essays on Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who had come down to the deep South, to Mississippi, and um, um, in August 1955, a fisherman pulled out a decomposed body from the Tallahatchie River. It was the body of Emmett Till. Okay, so Till had come to visit his cousins who lived in uh, the town, the a hamlet, a small rural hamlet of Money, as in the as in money, coins, currency, the town of Money in Mississippi. Yeah, it's come there to spend the summer vacation with his uncle and with his cousins. And apparently, and this is where I think she has a slightly more exaggerated account of Till's own audacity and perhaps foolishness, because apparently, according to her, Till uh, would tell his uh, um, black cousins that he had a way with white girls and with white women, and that he could hook a white girl very easily. And so they say, "Oh, really? Do you think you can do that? And can you sort of offer us a little demonstration, so to speak, of that?" And this is what led to the tragedy, because he goes into a store, which is uh, a kind of like a corner store, and he this is a store which uh, was a store where he makes a pass at the woman who was behind the counter, a white woman, right? And the way that Susan Brownmiller describes it, it sounds almost uh, that he makes a real pass at her, and in fact invites her for a date almost. This is not corroborated by many of the other sources that we have, and but the difference here is not, excuse me, not critically important to the argument that she wants to make. The gist of it is that she kind of shoves him aside, according to her, and he goes back home. Um, and at 2 a.m., her husband and I think it was his brother or half brother or someone like that. Uh, they appear at the place where Emmett Till is sleeping, and they take him away, and he's never seen again. And then, of course, his decomposed body is found. So this is the case of Emmett Till. Now, what is the scholarly? What have the scholars said? Some of them in critique of Susan Brownmiller's version. Partly the critique is what I've suggested, uh, um, that she gives a kind of an overblown account of what he may well have done. What is certainly very clear is that Emmett didn't quite understand. Emmett Till didn't understand that he was in the Deep South. He was not in Chicago. And then in the Deep South, there was a very clear line, a boundary, a wall between blacks and whites, and particularly between white women and black males, right? But the supposition also has to do with how the question of race is being treated, because in her account, okay, what she's trying to suggest in her whole narrative over there is that the story of Mrs. Bryant, so to speak, okay, right, is not unimportant. And yet, in some ways, she is obscured from the fundamentals of the narrative, because the fundamentals of the narrative all focus really on race and the difference between black men and white men, right? I won't get into the whole discussion of the Emmett Till case there, but she brings it up. She takes it up. And I think it's going to be important to move rather to uh, to her discussion of what Eldridge Cleaver, okay, had to say about this case. So Eldridge Cleaver, of course, is was a famous Black Panther, right? And he wrote a book called Soul on Ice, where he describes his reaction at that time, right? When he saw in a magazine a picture of the white woman with whom Emmett Till was said to have flirted. So Eldridge Cleaver was 19 years old, and he spelled out his reaction, which she quotes at length. Susan Brownmiller. Let me quote that passage from Eldridge Cleaver. While looking at the picture, I felt that little tension in the center of my chest I experience when a woman appeals to me. I was disgusted and angry with myself. Here was a woman who had caused the death of a black, possibly because when he looked at her, he also felt the same tensions of lust and desire in his chest, and probably for the same general reasons that I felt them. I looked at the picture again and again, and in spite of everything, and against my will, and the hate I felt for the woman and all that she represented, she appealed to me. I flew into a rage at myself and America, at white women, at the history that had placed those tensions of lust and desire in my chest. End quote. What an extraordinary passage. Now, Susan Brownmiller is going to interpret this whole passage, because Cleaver is saying, Eldridge Cleaver is saying, that look, I felt kind of like when I look at the picture of this woman, I feel a kind of a desire, and yet I feel revolted and repulsed because of this woman that this black boy died. And it's because of women like her that other black men have died. And what, of course, Susan Brownmiller would say, and this is where her reading of the Emmett Till case in that sense is a bit different, right, as well, is what she's going to say is that, yeah, but Cleaver doesn't recognize that white women are entirely subjected to the power and control of white men, right? And what's happening here, that white women are becoming conveniently the object at which you can direct your anger. But we must realize that there is something else in this story, and this story really, once again, has now become a story really of the particular use of rape by men to convey a message to the women of the other community that Till may not have recognized, perhaps given the fact that he was somewhat young, what he was doing. But in that act of flirtation, whether it was as serious an act of flirtation as she described, some sources have suggested less so, but perhaps some flirtation, he was already beginning to exercise the rudiments of his own power over a woman. It takes a lot of interpretive work, of course, to arrive at that kind of reading, but this is where Susan Brownmiller is actually quite forthright and saying that, look, we need to really understand what's happening here, right? Okay. And then now let's continue. She says that Eldridge Cleaver says in his own book, Soul on Ice, from where that passage was, that 2 days after he saw this picture and he had these ideas, he had a mental breakdown. Okay. And he, quote, ranted and raved. He himself is saying this, and she's quoting him. He ranted and raved against white women in particular. Quote, somehow I arrived at the conclusion that, as a matter of principle, it was of paramount importance for me to have an antagonistic, ruthless attitude towards white women. And then Cleaver says, I became a rapist. And he's not speaking here metaphorically. Apparently, from Susan Brownmiller's reading of it, he, in fact, actually went around raping women, white women in particular, right? Because it was really white women who were to blame. They had provided the perfectly acceptable excuse for rape. And what she's saying is that this story is now going to continue because there are going to be white liberals, for example, who are going to sometimes exonerate black men raping white women, saying that, well, we have to understand the history. We have to understand, where they've come from, right? And of course, this is all part of the larger story of rape as retaliation. And once again, we can see where now it becomes a larger story. It's not simply a story about an act inflicted upon, a brutal act inflicted upon a woman by a man, right? And I think the discussion here is very complex, very interesting, pages 274 onwards. Um, and then she takes on Frantz Fanon, and beginning by saying that he's the darling of the new left. I think that she's absolutely right and continue to be the darling of the new left. And unfortunately, I regret to say he's still the darling of the left, of a certain kind of left. The kind of the fetishization of Fanon has not yet, we have not seen the end of it yet so far. So she says, as a doctor of psychiatry, page 275, and a student of colonialism, Fanon was in an excellent position to make a substantial original contribution to the world's understanding of rape as a means of oppressing native women in Algeria and the Antilles. But Fanon's concern, to which he returns again and again, it is something of an obsession, is with the native man and the white woman. Whoever says rape says Negro, he announces in black-skinned white masks. In preface to his morbid rehash of the super Freudian, a Negro is raping me, theory of white female masochism, pronounced by Marie Bonaparte and Helen Deutsch. We won't get into who these people are. Here is Fanon's rendition of the familiar theme. When a woman lives the fantasy of rape by a Negro, it is in some way the fulfillment of a private dream, of an inner wish. It is a woman who rapes herself. She's quoting Fanon. The fantasy of rape by a Negro is a variation of this emotion. Quote, I wish the Negro would rip me open as I would have ripped a woman open. Right? And what is her verdict on this? Purely and simply, Susan Brownmiller says, and I quote her, this radical theorist of third world liberation was a hater of women. With an arrogance rarely matched by other radical male writers, Fanon goes on, quote, those who grant her conclusions on the psychosexuality of the white woman may ask what we have to say about the woman of color. I know nothing about her. Right? And we could go on with a further elaboration of all of this. I will stop here and only reiterate that yes, there there are things in this book which are deeply unsettling. I think what is extraordinary is the book is 50 years old. So Susan Brownmiller died this year, but it's also the 50th anniversary of this book. And I think this book is still very readable. And it's not clear to me, at least, that the story that she is giving here and the interpretive moves that she's making here are any less valid today than they were back then. And of course, in a word, the rape of women everywhere is made possible by the deep contempt, it appears to me, that many societies still display towards their own women and all women.